Hello, I'm Monsignor Jim Lisante. Today on Personally Speaking, I'll be joined by author Dale Allen. Dale's award-winning novel is called A Prayer for the Devil. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and author Dale Allen joins me now. Dale's award-winning novel is called A Prayer for the Devil. It's a mystery about politics and religion. It was first published in 2013, and then there was a sequel, and that book is called Brothers, Killers, and Saints. It's been completed and will be published shortly. Dale is a graduate of Fordham University and has had several senior positions in global Fortune 250 companies. He's here with us today to talk about his life, about his Catholic faith, about his passion for writing. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking the wonderful author, Dale Allen. Thanks, Dale, for being a guest on our show. And I've got to ask you, everybody I know believes they have one good book in them. If they ever get down to sit down and write a book, they're going to tell the world something important, but you actually did it. You moved from a job that is fairly traditional and in a very creative and dynamic way came up with this incredibly well-done novel, A Prayer for the Devil. What made you find the capacity within yourself to move from the idea we all have, someday I'm going to write the great American novel, to actually doing it?
Well, first of all, Monsignor, thank you for having me. And secondly, I believe everybody has a book in them. And I've always enjoyed writing from a young age. I would always jot things down. During trips, on business trips, I was always typing on my laptop. It's just always been part of me. So one day I said, you know what, I think I can do this. I sat down and started, and I don't know, a year later, I think I was finished.
And how did you get the insights, like the creative juices flowing to make something that was unique and different and special as A Prayer for the Devil is? Everyone I know who's read it has been very moved by it, and they say they really can't put it down. Did you know that you had that kind of storytelling ability always? Did someone early in your life encourage you to keep on keeping on with writing?
Yes, one person in particular. When I went to college, my creative writing teacher one day asked me to stay after class. And when I did, she actually, I was a very shy kid. I never really talked at all. And I was petrified. I was like, what did I do wrong? Well, anyway, to make a long story short, she wound up telling me that our first assignment was, she had read what I had written. And she basically said, you should be a writer. And I think that always stayed in my mind my whole life. Now, my background, we came from I would say a lower middle class family. My dad was murdered when I was a young boy. And so when I got out of school, my goal was to make money to get our family, give our family some stability. But it had always been on my mind that I should write. And then during trips to Hong Kong and back with my job, as I always say, my laptop became my best friend, and I just started writing. To tell you the truth, Monsignor, I don't know where the stories come from. I don't know how they're put together. A lot of times, I'm a kid who's a very poor reader, a very slow reader, a very poor speller, about the worst speller in the world. But I truly believe there are times when I sit down and I'm writing that, God is in control, and I was meant to do this. So that's how my writing, progressed. And, there are times where for a person who's, not a very good typist and not a very good speller and a terrible reader, there are times when things are just, typing, coming out of me at unbelievable rates of speed. And I know I couldn't do this alone. So I think I write stories that I hope people find intriguing. And as you know, they always do have, some of the, something about God and something about morals and something about, the forgiveness of Christ in everything I write.
Dale Allen is our guest. He's the author of A Prayer for the Devil, and the other book is Brothers, Killers, and Saints, which we'll talk about. You dropped something in one of your earlier comments that I obviously can't let go of, but how in the world do you, as a young guy, process the loss of your father, and specifically at 12 years old, the loss of your father to being murdered. Do you remember how you got through that?
Yeah, I do. It's some things you just never forget, and I think for everyone who's had a tragedy like that in their life, they can remember it like it was yesterday. But I'll just take you back about 2 weeks before my dad was killed. What was interesting, Monsignor, is that he was in Kentucky on an extended business trip, and I happened to write him a letter. And as we know, back then we didn't have computers, so I struggled to write this thing. And I remember, I think it was like 2 pages, and I can remember writing it like it was yesterday. And then I remember running down to the mailbox, which was a couple blocks away, and actually placing the letter in the mailbox. But anyway, when my dad did die, and I'll tie this in a minute, I didn't know people died. When you're 12 and,
Right.
You're pretty much a happy kid, you don't realize that, these things actually happen. But one of the things that had a tremendous impact on me, of course, was, trying to understand, trying to forgive, trying to process all of this. But I'll never forget, I didn't go to the funeral because I think my mom thought it would be too much for me. And he was buried actually in Kentucky where he was raised. But I remember my uncle calling a few days later, and he got me on the phone, and he said, Dale, I want you to know your dad was buried with your letter in his pocket.
Wow.
So that's when I fully understood, the power of writing. Sorry.
Yeah. I know this is a related but harder question to answer. I can't imagine if anyone hurt people I love that I could ever move into any capacity of forgiveness. And, that's a big part of our faith, to be sure. We're talking about following a Christ who's on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. But how in the world did you, again, as not just the 12-year-old, but even in the years since then, the loss of this major, important part of your life, how did you come to, or have you come to, a process of forgiveness for the person who did this terrible deed?
Well, Monsignor, I tell myself that I've forgiven this person, but I don't know, sometimes I have a hard time convincing myself. As I know it's the right thing to do, and I believe that, that's what God wants me to do. I believe that's what I tell myself every day, but there are still times when I question if that forgiveness is really all the way there. So I think over time, I always tell everybody, it's not something you ever get over. It's just something you learn to live with. And I think over time, I've learned to live with it. And I do my best to, convince myself I've forgiven this man, but only God knows.
Yeah, but that's very honest of you, Dale, to be able to say, I'm not quite sure I've arrived, but I'm certainly trying to be on the road that leads to some kind of reconciliation, some kind of forgiveness. For our listeners around the country, Dale Allen, as I mentioned, has written a book called A Prayer for the Devil and another called Brothers, Killers, and Saints. And one of the dynamics in his writing is this unique and interesting relationship between a Muslim woman and a Catholic priest. Dale, in writing this novel, did you have any particular insight into people of the Islamic faith?
Well, I do, because I have a few friends who are Islamists, and I remember, as vividly as everyone else, what happened after 9/11, where, all of us, including me, were worried and what's the word? I'll say, just maybe threatened by people of the Islamic faith. And when I wrote the book, it has to do with terrorism and, of course, with an Islamic terrorist. I didn't want to, cast all people of one religion in the same light. So I think one of the unique things about the plot is that I took a Muslim woman whose sisters also killed. The book basically is about a priest whose brothers, identical twin brothers, killed in a terrorist bombing incident in Boston. And when the authorities slow in their progress in the case, he actually takes a little bit of a leave of absence from the priesthood and searches for his brother's killers himself. But I thought it would be unique to have a Muslim woman whose sister was also killed in the bombing to show that all people have the same desire for justice, the same pain when somebody in their family is taken away from them. and not to just make it about, Christianity versus Islam. So I thought the way these two get together and the way that they respect each other, and of course at first they're very suspect of each other because of their religious differences, but as the story goes on, they grow into an incredible bond where they, unite their hearts and minds to find their siblings' killers. So I think that may make the book a little bit more interesting for readers because, just because of that relationship.
Definitely does. And Dale Allen is our guest. Dale, you're highlighted for me, too, the inclination in our human nature to presume we know all people because of a few bad apples, as it were. I remember even before 9/11, when the Oklahoma bombing happened, I just presumed it had to be people who were Islamic terrorists who would do such a terrible thing in our American city of Oklahoma City. And then when it came out to be a homegrown terrorist like Timothy McVeigh, I was embarrassed and shocked, and it opened my mind to the reality that there's both enormous good in every faith and in people everywhere, but there's also the possibility in everyone of embracing the dark side, and I think you addressed that beautifully in A Prayer for the Devil. Dale Allen, as I mentioned, is our guest. Dale, one of the other things you don't shirk from in your writing is what we call the scandalous maneuverings within the Catholic Church. Now, you're not some naive practitioner of the Catholic faith. You're well aware of the mistakes that have been made, the scandals that have occurred, the cover-ups, and all the rest of it. I always wonder then when someone actually lives out their faith or tries to, practices their faith, which I know you and your wife Lisa do, how is it that the so-called scandalous maneuverings within the Catholic Church that you even write about in your novels have not driven you away from the Church?
Well, as you know, I think it's just all about faith, right? And again, we can't take the few and put their sins onto, everyone else. I'm more appalled, or as appalled at that, that reckless, sinful behavior as anybody. But at the end of the day, I think that people need to remember that is a small percentage of the people who, the priests who do follow Christ. I know that, people would. I don't think there's anything worse than somebody who abuses a child. I just want to be clear about that. And for me, that's something I don't know if I could ever forgive, because that's, I think that people who do that, I'm sure God will judge them, but at the end of the day, that's one of the areas in my life where maybe I'm not, my Christianity doesn't show through as much as it should, because
right.
I would, I'd be happy for those people to rot in hell, because I just don't think it's right. And I think that you ruin so many lives by just, taking 1 minute away from a child, that I don't think people, I can speak strongly enough about how I feel about that. But at the end of the day, just to be clear, that's a small percentage of the faithful. That's not a large percentage. And I think part of the reason when I wrote Prayer for the Devil, this priest in the book, he's a cool guy. He's not. I think if you take people who are non-religious and you ask them what they think of a priest, they would say it's either a guy who prays in church and is very boring, or it's a guy who, takes advantage of children. At the end of the day, people need to realize there are priests who have gone to the Olympics. There are priests who are debate champions. There are priests who are actors. There are such incredibly interesting priests that this is not what what the priesthood is about. And the other thing I will say is that I think that people, when I go to church, most of the people in church are, senior citizens or older people. There, you don't see that many of the young people. And I thought maybe by writing this book, we could get some of the fence sitters to say, you know what, the priesthood is a good thing, and there are great things about going to church. And God, Jesus was a lot of things, but he was never, ever boring. And I think sometimes the church tends to make Jesus a little boring when I think, how do you take the most exciting figure in history and not show how excited you are about him? So I think that's my motivation for writing.
Our guest, as I mentioned, is Dale Allen. He's written a powerful book called A Prayer for the Devil, which I hope our listeners will certainly read, and his sequel, Brothers, Killers, and Saints. Listening to you, as our listeners are around the country, Dale, we know that You clearly are a man who takes his faith seriously, but I'm always intrigued by family of origin, like somewhere along the line in your upbringing, somebody or something planted the seed of faith in you that has blossomed as you're now an adult. But do you remember at all how you were taught or how you learned or how you became the person of faith that you are? Like, where did this stem from?
Well, it's interesting, Monsignor, because my mother was a devout Catholic and still is, thank God. And when my father really started leaving us when I was around 7 years old. So there was some issues in the marriage, and my dad was back and forth. But one thing always remained constant, and that is that we were always at church every Sunday, no matter what. And for my poor mother, I had two older brothers, so much of her time in church was spent when, moving one of us from one side of her to the other side in the pew, because we'd be fighting or kicking the people's feet in front of us who were kneeling down. We were just terrible kids. But I think that started my faith. But I have to tell you, for me, it's been a struggle, because I'm not one of those people who was, standing at church one day and a beam of light came down and hit me and said, you know what, now you believe. I felt like I always had to fight for my faith. And it's a fight that I've won, but it wasn't an easy fight. It wasn't a short fight. I had to continue to go even though I didn't want to go. I had to continue to pray even though sometimes I said, I don't think this is doing anything. When my dad was killed, I spent a few years mad at God. So,
sure.
This was not, I'm not one of the blessed people who, one day walked in and was transformed, and I'm happy for anybody who's lived through that. But my faith was a fight, and I had to fight to receive the blessings I received.
In Dale Allen's books, A Prayer for the Devil and Brothers, Killers, and Saints, the key priest we're talking about is Father Luke. And what's striking to me, Dale, is that you have an insight into these interesting and unique and different as people can be priests, but particularly Father Luke. Growing up into your adult years, did you run into or get to know intimately various priests? How do you find, or where did you get the insight into the kind of people who have embraced the priesthood? Because clearly in your novels, you do have a deep sense of reverence for priests, but also you seem to know them humanly. Where did that come from?
Well, I have been fortunate, because I think my writing helped bring me closer to the church, and the recognition that I received through the writing has brought me closer to a lot of priests. I did have one priest in my youth who was actually a really a nice person who used to talk to me and tried to guide me a little bit. But I've become close to quite a few priests, especially after the books came out. I've even had people reach out to me from West Virginia and California, to different from all Christians basically, but not necessarily Catholics, but ministers and chaplains and people like that. So I've been very blessed, because over the last 7 or 8 years I've become closer to many priests, and but I don't think there's one that stands out. I would say, if anything, my mother was the strong person, pushing all the time. Watching her say the rosary every day, and to this day she spends over an hour and a half every day saying her prayers. So I think more than any one person that brought me closer to God, she was it. But as you know, Monsignor, even my relationship with you, I learn so much. I admire so much people who do what you do. And I have to tell your listeners, if they ever get a chance to go to church, go to one of Monsignor's masses. You will not be bored, and you will see the power that one person can make over an entire congregation. It is amazing.
Well, Dale, you're a kind man to say that. Dale Allen's our guest. His book is A Prayer for the Devil, and I wanted to ask you about that, too. So our listeners around the country here, wait a second, this man's novel is called A Prayer for the Devil. How can we pray for the devil? Tell us how you came up with the title of that great book.
Well, as you know, the publishers kind of help with the title, and it's interesting because title is so crucial. Everybody's searching. We were emailing back and forth, title after title. I had my views, they had their views. My first title for the book was Into Temptation, but I'll never forget, though, I was actually sitting up sitting up on my bed, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and when the lady on the other end said a prayer for the devil, I actually got a chill go down my spine, and I said, oh, my God, that's it. So to explain it a little further, what happens in the book at one point is that the priest is being attacked by the terrorist, and he's running across the ice in Boston Harbor, and the terrorist, who actually happens to weigh about 50 pounds lighter than the priest, actually falls through the ice. And the terrorist gun slides by the priest, so when the priest picks up the gun, he walks back to the man in the water, and he picks up his arms to pray. And when I'm not going to tell you whether he actually shoots him or not, but when he picks up his arms to pray, somebody from a helicopter, who's a rescue helicopter, takes a picture. And when he's asked about it, he says, I felt like I was saying a prayer for the devil. So that's right. Where, this is not praying to the devil. It has nothing to do with, any type of satanic stuff. He was praying for the
It's a great title, though. I think it's a colorful title that invites people to say, I want to find out more about this book. Dale Allen is our guest, the author of A Prayer for the Devil. As I mentioned to you off the show today, often enough, Dale, we have had novelists on, Dean Koontz and Nicholas Sparks and Mary Higgins Clark. But Mary Higgins Clark, especially, as she just passed recently, said that she went through endless experiences of writing what she thought was great stuff and being rejected and rejected and rejected. Took her literally years and many, many rejections before something of hers got published. Now, we all supposedly have the confidence of God within us to do what we have to do as God calls us to do it. But I have to ask you, I'm so happy that A Prayer for the Devil has done well, but how do you, when you've written something that you believe in, handle it when it's not appreciated by the publishing world or that secular society out there?
It's a really tough thing, because rejection, I have to tell you, rejection is not easy, but for me anyway, it's been something that you can get used to, which is not a good thing. I think if we look at every major author, including J.K. Rowling, who was rejected numerous times, even Dr. Seuss, I mean, you could go through the list. This is not an easy path. It was funny because when I wrote a book, and originally I didn't want to get it published, I had no desire to do that. And then one of my friends, who happened to be on Billy Graham's board of directors, read it and said, this needs to be published. And that sent me down this entire path of even harder work. So I thought writing the book was the hard part. That's the easy part. Getting it published and getting people interested is the really hard part, especially with the changing landscape of the publishing business now, and self-publishing and the e-books and everything else. So I think of what I would tell anyone who sits down to do this is just that if this is what was put in your heart, you can't give up. And I think I've become the expert at not giving up, although, everything's not working perfectly every day. I wake a lot of nights I go to bed and I'm disappointed, but every morning I tend to wake up and say, I can do this, and I just keep pushing forward again. So,
what we're talking about is never giving up hope, which is very much behind so much of what you write and the way you write. Dale Allen is our guest. His book is A Prayer for the Devil. When we had the interview with Nicholas Sparks, I said, how did you get an agent? And he said, well, I wrote probably to 50 and only one responded. That person became my agent for many years because they bothered to take a chance on a new author. I have just a few moments left, Dale, but one of the things that I do in church regularly is before I do a wedding, I ask people to help me preach better at their wedding by writing an essay on why of all the people in the world they could marry, why is this the one? You have this beautiful relationship with Lisa, your wife, and you guys share so much, including faith. Why Lisa?
Well, I think that, sometimes God brings people together, right? And I think under unusual circumstances, sometimes we're brought to the right person. So I would say in my situation, that's just what happened. It was unexpected, it was unplanned, and through, I would say, an act of God, we met each other. And the other thing I would just say is when it's right, it's right. So
right.
I can't put more to it about that than that because I don't really understand it fully myself.
The mystery of love, the mystery of love. For our listeners around the country who having heard us in this interview say, well, this man's book, A Prayer for the Devil, intrigues me, and his writing, Brothers, Killers, and Saints, more intrigue. How, Dale Allen, do people from around the country who listen to a show like this find your work and pick up a copy of the book and get to know your writing and its amazing ability to, as one author said, one critic said, the author's multifaceted character is what gives the book distinction. You write with such color and insight into the human character. How do people get your work, Dale?
Well, thank you, Monsignor. Everything's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
I'd like to thank Dale Allen for being with us on Personally Speaking. He's, I know him off camera, as they say. He's a wonderful human being who means everything you heard him say today about the importance of his faith, the experiences of doubt that we all go through, the grappling we all go through to truly forgive, especially those who have hurt us so deeply as he's been hurt by the death of his father. The experience of the miracle of God in our lives, finding a way to introduce him to his beautiful wife, Lisa, and his unwillingness, because he believes he's been given a gift to communicate through writing, to give up or be discouraged. You know, one of the greatest forces of negativity in the world is discouragement. But he knew he had something to say, and through A Prayer for the Devil and Brothers, Killers, and Saints, he says it magnificently, and he has put his work out there for people to read and to have more insight into the church, into the distinction of various faiths, and into the process of trying to be a person who understands the mystery of God in our lives. I thank Dale Allen for his writing. I hope our listeners around the country will pick up A Prayer for the Devil, and I hope, Dale, that we hear for many, many more years to come from you and your insights into God and people and God's plan for us. Thank you so much for being with us, Dale.
Thank you, Monsignor, and God bless.
As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us today. If you'd like to reach out to us, you can go to our website, which is www.closeencountertv.com. closeencountertv.com. Personally Speaking is also a podcast with some of our most recent shows. You can go to YouTube and search Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante and subscribe there. We'd love to have you be a subscriber to Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante on YouTube. Personally Speaking is also available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, on iHeart, and on Spotify. You can also listen to past episodes by going to, once again, www.closeencountertv.com and clicking on the radio button at the top of the page. I'd like to tell you that I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer, Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Our engineer is Chris Walich. And our audio facility is Dream Recording Studios in Belmore, Long Island, New York. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.